we're going to give them a minute or so and wait for people to come in, and then we're going to get started here.
Okay, I'm going to go mute myself.
Okay, so I think we're going to get started, and folks are going to continue to come in, and but I'm going to share my screen. So welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents interactive conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. And the Authors Forum is a series within On the Park Bench which discusses recently published books by urbanists or of interest to urbanists. And today we're going to be talking about the book, La Città Sana, The Healthy City, the New Garden City for the Post-COVID-19 World, with co-author Gabriele Tagliaventi, and a discussion with interviewer Dhiru Thadani. And you can register for our coming webinar next week, December 21st, also at 12 noon, with architects Eric Ost of Urban Design Associates and Brian O'Looney of Torty Gallis and Partners, who will discuss trends in urban housing and how architectural types may respond to these changes that are taking place right now. And David Kim of Anderson Kim Architecture and Urban Design, a CNU board member, will be the interviewer. So go to cnu.org/resources/on-the-park-bench. And I wanted to remind everybody about CNU 30 in Oklahoma City coming up now in less than 4 months, March 23rd through 26th, 2022. It's going to be CNU's first in-person Congress since 2019. Everybody is looking forward to that. Meet your colleagues, learn from some of the best urban designers in the world who will be there, walk the city, and learn from Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City has done some amazing things in terms of bringing back its downtown and adjacent neighborhoods. And cities all across the US, even the world, can learn from some of the things that Oklahoma City has done. You can register now at cnu.org/CNU30. And I wanted to remind everybody to join or renew your membership. And being a current member, you can save $200 off your CNU 30 registration. And you can check your membership status today, because many people think of themselves as CNU members, but don't always have a current membership at this time. But find out at members.cnu.org/memberships to look up your membership status. And we've got a great show today with Gabriele Tagliaventi, who's an architect and full professor of architecture at the University of Ferrara, Italy. He's been a primary figure of the movement for the European urban Renaissance and the new urbanism in Europe since the 1990s. And he's co-author of La Città Sana. And Dhiru Thadani, architect and urbanist, is the moderator and interviewer today. As a design principal and partner, he has completed projects the world over. Dhiru is also an author of many books, including the recent Visions of Seaside, and he has been a producer of many of these authors' forums. I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's Public Square. La Città Sana, the Healthy City, the New Garden City for the Post-COVID-19 World, explains the characteristics of a healthy city, its development starting from the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1920, and its various declinations, starting from the Garden City up to the 15-minute city, passing through the experience of urban villages and garden pocket neighborhoods. And this healthy city topic is going to be a topic that the world is going to be discussing over the next few years. What is a healthy city? And we've got, this is going to be a great discussion today, a great beginning of that discussion. And we're going to have a brief presentation from Gabriele, followed by a discussion with Dhiru, followed by Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And I'll now pass this on to Gabriele Tagliaventi. So you can share your screen, Gabriele.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot. I really have to thank Dhiru and Rob for this kind of invitation.
Do you want to do full screen?
Yes. Just a second. How is it? There is a kind of stuff. Wow. What happens? Why? We did it before, but apparently.
Lower right, little screen there with a line through it.
Yes, but there is a kind of pop which is avoiding me from.
If you move your mouse to the lower right, you'll see it. Yeah, keep going. That's it. Presentation. There you go.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Dhiru. Thanks. Okay, so why first we did this book? A kind of 20 years ago, we did a couple of books on right on the new urbanism and another one on the garden city. Then, of course, COVID arrived, and there was really no need of such an experience to understand the value of a healthy city. We knew it even before. COVID-19 has been only a kind of incredible, gigantic scientific experiment, and which has demonstrated exactly what we knew, that if you live in a healthy city, you have a lot of advantages without COVID, first of all, for the post-COVID world. But in the unfortunate case, you have to suffer and pass through a pandemic experience, if you live in a healthy city, is far better. Donatella and I, we have been collecting data since the beginning of the COVID pandemic in order to check whether the pattern of the 1918 and 1920 Spanish flu was in fact repeating, because there were several similarities, and it was interesting for us to understand whether the pattern was really repeating or not, and what are the differences between the 1920s and the current one. But of course, there was no need to understand through the COVID what an healthy city is, a città sana, or what a sick city is. The healthy city is a city in principle where you can walk, It's a city based upon the walkability. It's a city where people have access to the public realm very easily, where people have shops and activities around the corner, where people live in cross-ventilated houses or apartments. And the healthy city is a city where every day, 365 days a year, you can walk. To work, to leisure, to entertainment, for jogging, whatever. And so, finally, thanks, let's say, to the lockdown and the amount of time we had, we kept on collecting materials and finally publishing the book. Of course, the book is published with the data of July this year, July 2021. But what is amazing is that when you check some data that you find in the book, like for instance, the data of COVID death in some metropolis, like the Australian ones, like Perth, like Brisbane, you find that after almost 5 months since the book was published, the data are exactly the same. The good news is that the death rate is stable at 0. Nobody dies in the last 5 months in Perth. Nobody died in Brisbane. Whilst when you make a comparison, for instance, the largest Australian city, metropolis, which is Sydney, more than 5 million inhabitants, and you make the comparison with the region where Bologna, my hometown, is Emilia-Romagna in Italy. Emilia-Romagna is a kind of 4.4 million inhabitants. Well, today, actually, this is the ratio between the two. 620, okay, increasing, unfortunately, in Sydney, but in the region, in the Emilia-Romagna region, it is 13,700 deaths. And it is in a region made of dozens of cities, towns, villages, where the population is spread all over the territory. So this is a kind of striking contradiction. In a metropolis, you have a much less, a dramatic better condition than in a region. So why? Why this? Of course, the Australian government did an incredible good job in preventing the spreading of the virus with very strict regulations. But in fact, the fact that metropolis cities are garden cities, but let me say, are mostly new urbanist cities, that has proved to be absolutely successful. Now, the problem is that the reaction by people, by inhabitants after the lockdown, the first, the second, and let's hope that we are not going into the third one, people are, in Europe at least, fleeing the city. This is a dramatic consequence of the pandemic. Here you see the data in Paris. It is the ratio, how many kids, how many children left schools in the last 2 years. In the entire municipality of Paris, 7.9% of kids are not anymore present. But in fact, the latest data are for 208,000 inhabitants of Paris have left the city in the last 2 years. 200,000 inhabitants out of a population of 2.3 million. It's an amazing 8-9%, absolutely consistent with the fleeing of kids from schools. So where these kids, where these families have gone? Somehow, like in the US, unfortunately, people try to flee the cities because they see the city as a kind of problematic environment where the spreading of COVID is much more easier. And where do they go? Let's say this is an article from Le Figaro, the main French newspaper, and Le Figaro Immobilier, the real estate section of the newspaper, speaks about the fleeing of people to the countryside, of course, and to the suburbs. What they are looking for is what you see in this image. They are looking for single-family houses, and unfortunately, you find in Europe, you find single-family houses where in the countryside, fortunately in the villages that are still present, and now, unfortunately, in the suburbs that are being built like in the US. So the big issue is let's provide an alternative for people who want to find a safer urban environment, a green urban environment. If they want to find an environment where to take kids to school in a pedestrian way and live in a single family house, is it possible to do that out of a suburb? Yes, it is. In fact, this is the data of Adelaide. Now, imagine Adelaide in Australia, 1.3 million inhabitants today for death out for COVID. Milan, Italy, which is same population, 1.3 millions, is 6,000 dead. And this is the amazing, the fantastic graph of Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, cities where people, fortunately, you see this is the death ratio in Brisbane is 0. Nobody dies. This is a fantastic good news. And of course, Australian, whilst Europe was under lockdown in February 2021, this year, in Australia, there was the Australian Open, part of the Grand Slam tennis tournament. And the interesting thing is that in Australia, the GDP per capita has not dropped down as much as in Italy. It is much, much better, even during these 2 years of pandemics. But then we have tried to collect data from different experiences. There are many, many cities from Europe and from the US. And this is, for instance, a striking comparison between Santa Barbara, California, and Bologna, Italy, my town. Now, the ratio is almost 3-to-1. In Bologna, people die 3 times than Santa Barbara. Today, both cities, in a different way from the Australian ones, they have increased the number of deaths during the last 5 months. But the ratio is always the same, 3-to-1. Now there is an interesting analysis of how Bologna had so many deaths. First of all, because out of the historical center, the rest of the city is made of huge concrete blocks, apartments, and people live in a kind of cage without cross ventilation, depending of mechanical, artificial, vertical connections, with underground parking, with the problem of elevators, etc. And when they get out to go for shopping, now imagine that in Italy, during lockdown, all shops, all local neighborhood commercial activities were shut down. Only big malls were open. So it was a kind of tragic trap. People living in a kind of cage the perfect environment for the spreading of COVID, then they get out for shopping. And where do they go for shopping? Here, in a huge box, with a queue, with the same stuff, artificial ventilation, etc. Now it is interesting because the Italian policy was very different from the French and the Portuguese policy towards commercial activities during lockdown. Italy has shut down all the small shops. France and Portugal, they have done exactly the opposite. Well, the result today is that if you take the same amount of population, 60 millions, you have that both France and Portugal have 30,000 less deaths than Italy. Maybe, of course, there are other reasons, but it is interesting to see how the big malls have affected the spreading of COVID, at least in Italy. And of course, medicine, science, the doctors always tell us that if you have a kind of social distance, if you disperse yourself in dozens, hundreds of small shops, is better for avoiding the concentration that you find in a big mall. And of course, if you live in a single family house with a garden, with fresh air, with the sun, if possible, and cross ventilation, is better too. Now, what we can do today? This is the second portion of the second part of the book. Well, we can look at what the previous pandemic, the 1920s, has done. Today, we have something more comparing with the 1920s. We have, for instance, the conscience that the 15-minute city is an advantage, and it is becoming popular. And of course, this 15-minute city is the ratio, the fundamental element that has shaped all the European towns and cities. And the image that you find, the graph, the very famous graph, is in fact a graph which is directly linked to what Leon Krier has always stated, that if you live in a 15-minute city, you live in a true city, and that of course the motorized sprawl anti-city has nothing to do with the European traditional city. But today, it is not only about traditional city, but it is about healthy. So how the 15-minute city works, this is an addition to the 1920s Spanish flu experience. Well, the 15-minute city works this way. You have everywhere a kind of corner shop available for your need. You can walk there. You have no need to take a car or to take a kind of mass transportation. And there are, of course, several examples of urban villages, like here in London, the famous Wimbledon one, again related to tennis. And of course, we know perfectly how the best healthy city works. It's a city which is in balance with nature, where the natural and the artificial environments coexist in the best way. So how the concept of the healthy city developed? Well, it started in the 1918, after the First War. You know, there was a tragic flu that we call Spanish, even if it's not sure that was Spanish. What is sure is that the Spanish newspapers were the only one who were devoting time to the spreading of the flu. The other newspapers were in fact interested and busy with the war, the First World War that was everywhere in Europe. And of course, the doctors, the governments told the citizens to do exactly what they did today, wear a mask. And of course, there was a tragic situation in hospitals. The data figures are about 50 to 100 million deaths caused by the 1918 and 1920 Spanish flu. And the problem was that there was no vaccine, no possibility of vaccination, no antibiotics, nothing. So medicine tried to find out a solution for providing people with a better environment. And this is the graph of the mortality in America and Europe during the Spanish flu. Now, somehow, it looks exactly like the current, the contemporary COVID-19. And the bad thing is that there is a third, as you can see, there is a third wave, and we hope that will be less dramatic this time than the previous ones. How people reacted? The reaction was go building garden cities, go building new cities where you can live in a healthy environment, where you can have fresh air, where you can have a garden, where you can walk, because walking is much better for your healthiness every day. And without antibiotics and without vaccination is even more relevant. And there was an incredible process of foundations. And this is the famous Coral Gable Garden City, one of the largest in the world, in Florida, and then Venice, and then all the others by John Nolan. But the same stuff happened exactly in Europe, in France, for instance, Osgore. Possibly the new garden city has to be in connection close to the seaside, because breathing the fresh air coming from the sea, from the ocean, doctors were saying it's much better for your healthy. But not only along the coast, there was a kind of mass foundation process of new garden cities. This is the map of the 35 new garden cities built in the 20s and 30s all around Paris. It's an incredible process where, in fact, you find a kind of new urbanist city, if you like. It's a garden city with shops, with a center, with a pedestrian pattern, and with a reasonable density, which is a kind of key factor today. You have to find an environment where you have fresh air, where you have a garden, but at the same time, you have to provide the city with a reasonable urban density in order to allow the corner shop to be there. And not only resort, but even social housing. This is the largest garden city built in Europe, is Dagenham in London, 108,000 inhabitants city built in the 1920s and 1930s, and with public transit, with a center, with the shops, with a kind of urban environment, entirely social housing. Same stuff you find in Ireland, in Dublin. This is the Marino Garden City, which is 100% social housing, with the tradition, the English tradition of circus, like in Bath, and you see the Garden City, which is built as a reaction, as a response to the pandemic. In Germany, close to Berlin, you find out a surviving garden city, the Gartenstadt Staaken, built by German architects according to the lesson of Heinrich Tessenhoff, and Paul Schmittenner was the chief architect of this garden city. Same stuff you find in Spain. This is a plan quite interesting for for new urbanism. This is a city that you find along the highway from Andalusia to Madrid. Is called Villanueva de Franco, was built after the Spanish Civil War. And of course, you have all the Australian garden cities, the metropolis, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, which in fact was a city founded before the official Ebenezer Howard Garden City book of the late 1800. Adelaide was in fact taken as an example for the garden city. And it is a fantastic piece of new urbanism with pedestrian access to shops and activities, and basically without the huge malls that you find both in American suburbs and today, unfortunately, even in European ones. And this is the new possibility that I think we have to build a new urbanist city for the post-COVID world, which allows people, even in small townhouses, to have the luxury of a single-family house. The single-family house can be urban. There is no need, in fact, to go suburban. There is the possibility, the technical possibility, and you can choose the style you prefer. And sometimes you can have a very interesting combination of garden city and sport, like for instance, the possibility to watch an important tennis tournament, or of course for your pets is a kind of nice. But the kind of nice is that in a garden city, you can find today also shops and activities at a pedestrian distance. And the new addition to the garden city of the 1920s is the urban village, like you find in many European cities, but also in American ones. Now, of course, the village, as the success of the village was something precedent of the pandemic. In the 90s, in the early 2000s, there was a kind of flee from Northern Europe to the Mediterranean villages because of internet, thanks to internet. And so many Germans, British, or Scandinavian went to southern Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, and live in a village. Now, living in a village means to have, in a way, the accessibility, the pedestrian accessibility that you have in a metropolis, simply at a different scale. And this different scale, which was becoming very popular through a movie like The Good Year, in fact, is a pattern also for metropolis, because in fact, we find garden cities and garden villages and urban villages even in metropolis. You find it in London, but you find it even in Paris. Paris is plenty of urban villages. The most famous one is Montmartre. Of course, it's an urban village, single family houses, but with public square, with shops, restaurants, etc. And not only Montmartre, you find it à la Butocaille, the opposite part of the city, the southern Paris. This is an urban village existing and plenty of social housing. All these houses are in fact social housing done in the 20s. This is social housing à la Butocaille. And of course, à la Butocaille, exactly as in Montmartre, you find the urban center with shops, restaurants, activities, swimming pool, public buildings, libraries, whatever. So I think this is the amount of tools that we have today to provide people with an alternative to the flee to suburbs. If they want to live in a safer urban environment, if they want to live in a garden area, the garden area can be even within the city. And we have a kind of range, a wide range of possibilities. We have the garden city, we have the urban village, we have the 15-minute city, and urbanism can be, we think, the best way to provide the post-COVID-19 world with a wide range of new possibilities to build an alternative to suburbs, which is healthy for every day, not only for the pandemics, but really for the ordinary life.
I wanted to remind everybody to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions. And we should probably be getting to a discussion with Dhiru pretty soon.
Gabriele, are you done with your presentation?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, okay. That was so. One of the amazing things about this book is the collection of places that you have documented in the book, and a lot that I wasn't familiar with. And it's really a pleasure to look through the book and see places from all over the world that adhere to these principles. But I want to get to this issue about, you talked about an appropriate or a reasonable density. So how do you describe a reasonable density?
This is this is tricky, eh?
You put the word out, so I want to, dwell some more on that.
Okay, let's say, let's start with the garden city principle, Ebenezer Howard pattern. Is 80 inhabitants per hectare. Okay. This is the let's say the reference for the garden city. Now, actually, if we consider the density of the municipality of Paris today is close to 230, 240 inhabitants per hectares, which means 3 times the garden city urban density. Now, what is interesting is that if you calculate the urban density of several European cities, take, for example, my hometown, Bologna, and you don't take, of course, the countryside, you take only the built area, then you find that the urban density of Bologna today is 48 inhabitants per hectare. 380,000 inhabitants on 19,000 hectares, which means is almost half the garden city pattern. Because of course, the built way, the huge concrete blocks were built, leaving huge empty areas. Now, what we find in the urban villages or in the garden cities built in the 1920s and in the Australian ones is that the urban density is higher than the original Ebenezer Howard pattern. Is 110, 120. The maximum we found was 130 inhabitants per hectare, which is absolutely, I think, a good urban density to allow shops, activities, and the kind of pedestrian experience that we find even in the larger cities like Paris. I think if the range between 80 and 150 can be the range we can use to build a healthy city today.
So
I don't know.
Okay, so for an American audience, it's 33 to 60 inhabitants per acre. So I just want to translate that because we tend to think here, at least we tend to think in acres, you'll think in hectares, but
Yes.
so 33 inhabitants. Okay. What about the the scale, the vertical height? Do you prescribe to the idea that shouldn't be more than 4 stories?
Well, again, let's try to focus on what we have discovered through this terrible experience. We have discovered that it is clear that not urban density, but the architectural type, which is the box, the apartment box building, 5 to 6 to 7, 10 more, is depending on elevators, is depending on mechanical and electrical systems. And the problem of COVID is that we have now evidence that the virus is spreading in these elements. So in a way, I think we should try to find a kind of limit which allows us to have the reasonable density and to avoid not let's say as a kind of ban, but the goal for our planning. I think the 3 to 4 stories building is the optimum, together with all is in between.
So,
Which somehow, for instance, is what Leon Krier has always explained was the best scale for a traditional European city. And it's amazing that this is today becoming more and more coherent with the idea of the healthy city.
So someone just mentioned that they'd like me to translate it to per square mile, and that comes to 21,000 per square mile. Just an anonymous attendee would like us to. So 21,000 per square mile. That's pretty dense still. I mean, I think you can get a fair amount of transit and retail supported in that within those numbers of 33 per acre. So that's great. Let me see. Stephanie asks, please tell us what you observed and what you recommend in terms of public space typology. We need to be that needs to be provided. So, public space.
Public space
within this, these.
Yes, I think there is a wide variety of possibilities. We start from the traditional urban piazza, which is a paved one with the shops or public buildings all around. But then, of course, we have the traditional British square, and in all its declination, means the circus, the crescent, whatever. We can have parks, of course. The American playground I think is a fantastic tool to introduce. For instance, in the European city, the European city has no playground. There is no possibility to play sport outside. Today is even more relevant after the pandemics, because of course the concept of healthy city is to practice every day a kind of healthy life, and walking is part of this process. But if you add the chance to practice sport around the corner, like in a playground, this is a fantastic experience that, for instance, American cities can teach European ones, because they do not have this kind of public space. And of course, parks too. The best way to separate urban neighborhood or urban villages within a metropolis is to use public parks, like in London, like in Paris. is a very effective way to build a huge city or a metropolis, to even using the park, the green, as a way to connect, at the same time connect and separate the different urban areas.
Yeah, we were talking earlier that the problem with a lot of garden cities is that they get infringed upon. So the green belt or what's surrounding them, making them discrete, soon gets eaten into by suburban sprawl. So you don't get that transition of the green belt. You get the parks within, which in most cases stay true, but they don't. We don't really get the outside, the exterior belt, which you get so often in Europe. And a lot of the examples you showed, European examples, do have a green corridor around the town, and it's limited, so it kind of limits the growth. Maybe in the European condition, that could also be playground, be used for playgrounds, or I mean, it's currently used for agriculture in most cases.
Agriculture, yes, of course. Of course, I think also agriculture is a new concept that has to be introduced within the city, because, for instance, the possibility to have small agricultural areas within the city is today becoming very, very popular. And of course, we know that that was a kind of traditional way to build cities. Within the medieval cities, agriculture was possible within in the urban lots, because of course the medieval city had the priority to defend itself, and sometimes it was not convenient and safe to get outside the walls. Today it's an important ecological and economical argument. Small agricultural areas within the city. And I think new urbanism has this great advantage that can talk and implement, of course, the traditional garden city concept, which in fact has evolved, because the one that you find in the 1920s is in fact slightly different from the first generation, let's say, of Letchworth, Welwyn, Hampstead Garden suburb. And this transition from the original pattern to the new one, adapted to the new conditions, I think this is what makes Garden City interesting. But this is new urbanism. It is new urbanism that can provide the culture and the technical means to operate it now.
Right. So, in many cases, we have someone talks about the box, the insipid box that is around these suburban areas. Is it possible to retrofit those without demolition? So you might demolish one or two to get an urban pattern, but that's also a possibility. It doesn't have to remain those. And there are some very good examples, at least in the US, some of the early new urbanist projects like Digstown, etc., done by UDA, actually inserted streets within these large compounds and really made them more like neighborhoods as opposed to projects. So that's another little piece that can be applied in the toolkit and transforming some of these places. So let's talk about newer. Most of this is always a question that comes up about traditional and modern architecture. I know that you've been involved in some Art Deco-like projects on the outside of Paris, where the architecture is completely modern. It was done for developers, but still based on these principles.
Yes, let's say the problem is that the easiest way in Europe today, the easiest way to give people what they ask today, which is we want to live, basically, they want to live in an open air pattern. The best way is, of course, for Europeans to have a single family house, which for American is the standard, but for Europeans is absolutely the exception, is a kind of goal. So today, developers are providing the easiest way, which is usually the suburbs. Sometimes, like you mentioned, outside Paris, there are examples where there is a more urban area, but using always modernist patterns, like for instance, the apartment block in the modernist way, without shops, first of all, not aligned along the street, so not creating the urban environment that we need if we want to have a city. And in fact, those areas actually operate on a daily basis exactly as suburbs. People get out from the apartments, take the car, and go to the mall. So the simple architectural pattern, the simple architectural building is in a way preventing the citizens from having a true urban experience. They do exactly as they live in a conventional American suburb, because of architecture, because the pattern is always the isolated object within a huge plot.
I was talking about some of the newer projects done by Maurice and yourself that does have mixed-use buildings in the suburbs. So really, though they are still apartment buildings, they provide all the services on the ground floor. Is that a pattern that you see might be, moving along, being accepted by developers?
Well, fortunately, the experience that we had were absolutely successful. Sometimes even, let's say, to my astonishment, because I didn't expect, for instance, that shops were taking and becoming fashionable in so fast, like they did. The problem is it depends, let's say, it depends on local mayor, local municipalities. Europe is very different from the US, because in Europe there is a kind of public policy for architecture. For instance, today the European Union is providing a kind of guidelines according to the Bauhaus 1920s experience. And the problem is that you are successful in doing some interventions in the areas outside the city, but then at the same time you have the national and supranational structures, like for instance the European Union in Brussels, who are producing a public policy funding with a lot of money modernist projects, the same projects that you find in the European periphery, done in 1950s, 1960s. So this is the kind of contradiction. Yes, what we did somehow is a source of hope and inspiration. It works. The problem is that every day you have to fight with what comes from a higher level, which is the global political structure.
Well, every place starts to look like every place else. You are now. So we have a few more questions in here, which I'm kind of trying to go through. John Massingale asks if your book was available in America and in Amazon, right?
Yes, Amazon. Also, the publishing company who did the book apparently is providing the same service, and a friend of mine who is living in Singapore has tested it. It works apparently, but Amazon is the main one. Yes.
And is it going to be translated into English?
It depends. I'd like. It depends.
You know, it's very interesting, even though I don't speak or read Italian. I found it extremely interesting because I could follow along with, you know, with the images and some of the graphs. So, and you know, it's such a tremendous collection of places, as I said earlier, that I wasn't aware of. So let me throw a little monkey wrench in here. You are familiar with Chandigarh, which is, you know, which when it was done, of course, modernist Siam ideals. But the buildings are set back. You have greenery in front of every building between the road, and the greenery now, you know, acts as a filter. And surprisingly, it is one of the most sought after. It's referred to in India as a garden city, if you can believe it, because the vegetation after now 70 years has grown so much that you really cannot see the buildings. So it's probably the most desirable place in India right now to retire as a retirement community. And also they're expanding it, not in the same, unfortunately, not in the same spirit, but they're expanding it in a kind of suburban way to try to capitalize on this move to the city. But Chandigarh, in its very early conception, did have these leisure valleys that cut through there every block, even though the blocks were huge. You could traverse the city by not actually going on a road. So you had these, all the creeks, the little waterways produced these leisure valleys, and all the public amenities, like the museums and schools, etc., were placed along these patches. They're very difficult to get to unless you have a bicycle. You could get around pretty well on a bicycle, but in most cases you needed a car because of the great distances. But one of the sectors, Sector 22, which is right next to the bus station, just south of the bus station, is probably the most successful. It's a golden section, 2,500 by 4,000, or 2,600 by 4,000 feet. So 100, whatever, 1,000 plus meters on a long dimension, and it's the one block, because of its proximity to the bus station, is where you have a complete mix of income groups in that one block. So you get two schools, you get a little shopping along the road that cuts through the middle, and you get this incredible variety of housing types, from the poorest, literally the poorest subsidized housing, that's basically one room house with a little courtyard, all the way to larger buildings away from that, a bus stop as such, or the central bus stop. So how would you categorize that phenomena of a place like Chandigarh within this?
I think this is interesting. We should, first of all, I regret not to being able to visit it directly. Next time I go to India, I definitely have to go there. No, I think it's an interesting combination. It offers the possibility to introduce modernist architecture within an urban pattern. Maybe the green is in fact a good way to soften the let's say the harsh, the hard way of modernism, of conventional modernism. The important issue is that it was conceived to be a city, and somehow because of its original idea, and because Indian people were accustomed and able, usually, traditionally, to build cities, then they have been able to create a mix I like very much this kind of natural or organic intervention when the community somehow takes over a rigid plan and makes it more friendly on a daily basis. I'd like to visit it, Dhiru. Really, I'd like to visit it.
There's a lot of transformations that have occurred there, mostly grassroots transformations that fill in the gaps that the planning did not fill in. So the inconvenience of the sector planning and the segregating zoning has been kind of circumvented by ingenuity and grassroots initiatives. So now and I got, a comment that Jennifer Hurley, a new urbanist, made when she was visiting it with me was she looked around and said, I'd rather be here than Houston. And because it was much more vital and dynamic and, there was a lot going on. It felt like, plus the population and, the density and all that. There's a lot of life and activity in a place like that. And now with the greenery having matured, it's a very desirable place.
Kind of a low bar, but kind of a low bar.
A low bar, but we're talking about garden cities, and that word has been transformed, at least in the Indian context, when you say garden city. That Bangalore used to be a garden city, but the trees have been wiped out for high-rise buildings, or all the gardens have been wiped out, whereas now Chandigarh, in fact, because of its tremendous setbacks, has those green spaces.
I wanted to remind people that we're now at the end of our hour. We are going to be posting this video online in a day or so, but we'll continue to ask maybe a few more questions before we end it all.
Okay, and it is recorded, so if you are running out of time, you can come back and Rob will post the session. So, Gabriele, any other insights that you want to share with us?
Well, apart from the data were really a kind of surprising ones, because I expected, I made the intuition was that the pandemic will somehow perform like the Spanish flu. But in fact, what strikes me is that when you compare the situations, we did the calculations on many cities. Usually we did, let's say, an Italian city, a French city, and an American one. And we tried to take same population, for instance, 100,000, 200,000. Now, what is striking is that you always find a ratio, let's say 3:1, means, and it is interesting because like the Bologna example proves, things are a bit more complicated when in the media you usually listen or read about the urban density. The tricky thing is that it is not, we know it is not exactly the urban density, it's really the architectural type and the environment produced by that architectural types that create or not the conditions for the virus to spread. And in fact, the big malls, the big boxes are an incredible evidence of that problem. What we discover comparing, for instance, the Italian situation, which is one of the worst in terms of mortality rate in Europe. Well, in fact, Italy has done this kind of policy, shut down every little tiny shop and just open the huge malls. So you could imagine the crowd, the incredible crowd. That one was somehow a kind of experiment, because they were recreating the bad pattern of the apartment building exactly outside with the big box. I think this is this is a great lesson that we can learn, because we have a lot of arguments, let's say, against the suburban mall. But this is another one adding to that. It is not safe, because it is much better to spread people in thousands of tiny little shops. Is much safer, is better for the everyday life, is much better in terms of economics, local economics. The local economy works much better, but it is also much healthier, which is the new thing.
Do you think that might have been a decision caused by, let's say, the new buzzword, supply chain, that smaller shops weren't able to get goods as delivered as much as the larger big boxes? Was that a response, you think, from the government in that direction?
The situation is getting interesting. For instance, in Europe, the big success, no, the gigantic success of Amazon today,
Yes.
is right, I think, because of the pandemic. People have discovered, and in a way is bad for the big boxes, because somehow people have learned that there are two ways to do shop today. One is if you have the shop nearby, around the corner.
Right.
They have discovered that is even safer. The second one, of course, is Amazon. But what is in between the big boxes is, let's say, appears to be the old way to do, and much more dangerous than the other two ones. Right. So the big chains are trying to adapt to this new condition, which is completely new, which is absolutely a new experience for everybody.
So a couple of questions. One is about the Spanish flu. How much do you think the Spanish flu influenced the Garden City?
I think a lot, because it was a kind of explosive phenomenon. If you take Italy only as an example, in between the 20s and 30s, Italy built some 200 new towns and cities. Right. 200, and the pattern was always the same, trying to find a healthier solution in balance with the countryside. The best location always to the seaside, like Sabaudia, for instance, but many others were built all around Italy, and of course even in Libya, because at that time Italy was ruling Libya. You find it. So the Spanish flu has given the Garden City the opportunity to be developed on a mass, a gigantic scale. It was regarded as the best solution everywhere. France, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, America, of course. In America, Florida, California, all the garden cities. But that great explosion of garden cities in the 20s was really influenced by the Spanish flu.
I recently visited Mondello in Sicily, outside of Palermo, just north of Palermo, another garden city along the water with a beautiful casino clubhouse in the middle of the Mediterranean, quite a stark, wonderful little piece of fairy tale architecture in the middle of the water, so I was, Harvard Baxman is asking about this pendulum swinging back, because now we've got internet, as you said, really pushing the issue that you don't really have to live. You can live just about anywhere you want. And what this pandemic has also shown us is that most people don't have to be in an office location. They can be remote. So that might help spawn more of these places that provide a quality of life.
There is the possibility. It is different it is very difficult to to predict the future, but let's say there is a chance. There is a chance, and of course it depends. I think it depends really on our ability to spread the message that it is possible to make a good use, for instance, of the home working. Yes, you avoid commuting, you avoid taking the car and driving an hour, 2 hours a day. And that time you can save for going to the square nearby, to find people at the restaurant, to meet people, to enjoy a kind of social life. So internet and the home working can be supportive of a new wave of new urbanism, if you allow me to say so. I think it's a possibility, because in fact it breaks the connection of commuting. Commuting was in a way forced by the fact that people were living in a place outside the city and they had to go to a gigantic box, office, let's say, box. Today, this is breaking, or in a way softening. It will not be so mandatory as it was before. A lot of people have understood, have discovered that working by home is not that bad, as a kind of has several advantages. Now, I think it's up to us to tell them, okay, now let's find out how living, working at home in an urban village, close to a square, close to a public plaza, see how beautiful that can be, how your life can be improved on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think the issue is that there's just not enough beautiful places. You know, so when you build anything that's remotely beautiful, it instantly escalates in price, making it unaffordable. So that, you know, we need one solution might be to build more and more places, you know, so more people have the opportunity to live in beautiful places, you know. Let's see, there's some more questions, but they're really long questions. And some of them are statements, so I'm having trouble. But there's a question about whether the central city can be made more livable by infusing one housing. That happens now. There's lots of office buildings have been converted to housing, or they're attempting to. It's very expensive and difficult. And also to inject biophilic design, gardens, etc., into the city, because a lot of cities lack green space. You know, so there might be another opportunity to start to retrofit some cities. I mean, we have retrofitting suburbia, which is, you know, can be quite difficult, but in the city grid system, you know, parking lots could be converted to gardens, and apartment buildings could bring those. So that's another possibility to introduce these principles that you've been talking about in existing cities. And also in small towns.
Small towns,
yeah,
absolutely.
Which all have the DNA of what you're talking about, but don't have the economic engine, or for some reason have lost the economic engine. So
no, exactly. The experience of let's say the Mediterranean village in the last 20 years before COVID, the village had an incredible success because of internet, basically. No,
right.
two factors: internet and, let's say, the European Union. It means that starting from the year 2000, people in Europe had the opportunity to live like in the US. So let's say within the same organization at a state level. Well, the village has proved to be a kind of micro city, because you find everything, really. in the city. Of course, you don't find the huge university. The best university is not there. The best hospital is not there. And planning, I think, today can and should incorporate that lacking issues on a regional scale. Because in fact, we have a pattern that works. If you take the area of southern France from, let's say, from Nice to Marseille, you find hundreds of villages where people live, and the population is completely is mixed. There are Italians, Americans, Germans. Is an international, global condition in a small, tiny urban piece. Now, I think that this concept on a regional scale, rationalized with the correct the infill of what is missing, like for instance, that can be another option. One possibility is to act at the micro level within the existing city. The possibility is to act at the retrofit level of suburbs, and then at a regional level using villages and connecting them on a regional basis. That's another option we can provide people with.
Great. Let's see. The historians in the group talk about the Garden City actually happening, the concept of the Garden City happening before the pandemic. Those ideas came out much before. And I just want to, I don't know if in your research whether you came across a book called Looking Backwards, 2000 to 1887. It was written by the American Bellamy, and Ebenezer Howard was a big fan of this, of Bellamy's work. And it has a very political agenda to the Garden City idea, where it's much more communal. The living in a garden city is much more communal and much more sharing of resources. And anyway, that book was read by, and he does claim that it influenced him. Now, the book came out in 1887, and it projects out 113 years looking back, what has happened in the past 100 years. And of course, the world's a wonderful, beautiful place because of all these small microcosm garden cities or communes or whatever, however you want to call them, which are all self-sufficient and have access to agriculture. So I don't know whether you came across that, but it is an interesting.
No, yes, I know that, and I'd like to remember that the original, let's say the birth of the Garden City was the reform, the movement for social reform. Right.
That's right.
It was the William Morris news from nowhere, the early socialist utopia of the 1800s. And that was the way. In fact, even the original title, Dhiru, it's interesting, the original title of the book was not Garden City, but was Tomorrow, a peaceful path to social reform. I think this is interesting. Then the success was so great that it became Garden City. But Garden City was the mean through which you could achieve social reform. I think we should not forget.
That's what I was trying to get to, that it was really a social reform and a very kind of utopian idea. At least in looking back, it's presented as a very utopian idea. And it was very much supported by the labor forces, because the Industrial Revolution and the differences, et cetera, in wealth, between the haves and have-nots. So it was supported, though Morris did disagree with this idea, the communal idea sharing. So, but he was well aware of that. So yeah. So I don't know, Rob, you going to tell us how many people are left, or whether we should continue?
Well, I mean, if you guys want to ask one more question and wrap it up, I think that would be good.
Okay, let's try to find. There's questions about online shopping, complicating the last mile of delivery. How can we better balance the use of the city streets in the garden city? So the last mile, how do we make it more efficient in terms of deliveries? You talked about Amazon, but I think one solution that's happened here is the common pickup point, where they don't bring the goods to your house, but they bring it to a center where you pick it up, and that's a possibility of not clogging all the streets. I mean, it's got
Yes.
It varies back and forth. It depends on how many of those those little centers you have. But I know that that's becoming a very popular option if you want the goods sooner. And once I think they start charging back for delivery. Right now, Prime is so convenient without delivery charge, but at some point they'll have to stop that. It just can't be affordable anymore. So, but anything else? I mean, you had, tell us this, why don't you wrap up with those 10 points that you had at the end of the book?
That was the let's say the funny part of the book. We tried to make 10 very brief tips on how to build an healthy city.
Right.
Very simple. Of course, the healthy city should be accessible.
Mm-hmm.
It means accessible by every means. First of all, you should be able to have access on a pedestrian basis.
Mm-hmm.
Second tip, you should have always a commercial street where you can walk to. So the healthy city is a place can be defined only where you can find a street where you can walk to for shopping. If you don't have it, it's not healthy, because of course you have to take car or whatever, but usually car, and go shopping. You need to have a public garden in your neighborhood to have an healthy city, because of course the garden provides you with a minimal green ratio for the everyday life. And then the plaza, you need to have, like in a village, the restaurant, the place where to find restaurants, bars, cafe, the place for social life, to have another dimension out of the internet, the internet one.
Yeah.
This is very, very important. For we should never forget that the healthy city starts from very simple elements, which are very physical. Like really, when we talk about the shops around the corner, means you really get out, and at the corner you find a shop. But the shop can be there only if there is enough urban density, and this is a kind of important and strategic balance we should always keep in mind, because otherwise even the aesthetic of a beautiful traditional garden city will not provide us with a really healthy city, because the healthy city has the aesthetics, but has also the shops, the public places nearby. That's why we tried to put 10 simple elements, a kind of checklist, whether you have or not, and what you should follow in order to accomplish the healthy city project.
Okay, that's awesome. Well, thank you, Gabriele, for a wonderful presentation and a discussion. And thank you, Dhiru. Once again, this will be posted video for people to watch again, probably tomorrow. And people will be notified of that. But thank you very much.
Well, thanks. And Gabriele, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
No, thank you all. Thank you all. Great experience as always. And thank you all.
I do want to say that for people who don't know Gabriele's work, because he's very modest, he's been doing these Biennale Triennales in Bologna for how many years? When did you start those exhibitions?
More than 20 years. We did five exhibitions, published 5 books, collecting hundreds and hundreds of built and unbuilt projects, but especially built ones on urbanism and traditional urban planning. So, you're very modest about that, but you've been around and you've been doing this research for a very long time and sharing all this knowledge with a much wider audience. So for that, I really want to thank you, a person after my own heart when it comes to sharing information. So thanks for being here. Thanks, Rob, for all your help with this. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Right?
Everybody have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks. Ciao. Bye. Bye-bye.